The council chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence as Ambassador Vrel's clawed appendage pressed the control panel. Above the circular assembly, a holographic display flickered to life, casting an eerie blue glow across the faces of delegates from 40 different worlds. The numbers floating in the air told a story that made even the most battle-hardened species representatives shift uneasily in their seats. 247 years of data. 12 expeditions. 12 complete failures. 0 survivors returned. Sector 7 Alpha remains completely impenetrable, Vrel announced, his natural clicking and chittering sounds converted into standard galactic language through the translation implant behind his eye. We have designated this region as human space, and despite 2.5 centuries of observation, we know absolutely nothing about what happens within those boundaries. The hologram rotated slowly, showing the sector in question. It looked ordinary enough from the outside, a sparse collection of star systems in a remote corner of the galaxy, far from major trade routes and populated worlds. Nothing about it seemed particularly special or threatening. Yet every species in the galaxy had learned to avoid it like a plague zone. In the back row of the chamber, Commander Lisa Garrett sat perfectly still. She was the only human in the room, the sole representative of her species permitted to observe council proceedings. Her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. She rarely attended these sessions, preferring to keep her distance from galactic politics. But today had been different. Today she'd received a formal summons that she couldn't ignore. Lisa watched the hologram with dark, knowing eyes. She said nothing, but her silence somehow felt heavier than the nervous chatter filling the chamber. The delegates from Meridian, tall beings who resembled walking trees with too many joints, whispered among themselves in their whistling language. The collective from Andrus, a hive-mind species that existed as a shimmering mass of interconnected consciousness, rippled with visible anxiety. Even the usually stoic warrior clans from the Outer Rim looked uncomfortable. Everyone in this chamber remembered the stories. Everyone knew the history. First contact with humanity had happened by accident, and from the very beginning, it had felt wrong. A human colony ship had drifted across the border into galactic territory, badly damaged and leaking radiation. Rescue teams had responded immediately, expecting to find either corpses or grateful survivors. What they found instead was far more unsettling. The crew had been in suspended sleep, floating in preservation pods that used technology nobody had seen before. When medical teams carefully revived them, the humans had been polite, almost friendly. They thanked their rescuers. They accepted food and medical treatment. They answered basic questions about their species and origins. But when offered integration into the galactic community, when shown the wonders of the civilized galaxy and invited to join the great alliance of spacefaring peoples, the humans had simply declined. Politely but firmly. They claimed that remote sector of space that nobody else wanted, the one filled with dim stars and unremarkable planets. Then they erected simple warning beacons around their chosen borders. The beacons broadcast in every known language, a simple message that chilled anyone who heard it: turn back. For your own safety. No threats. No explanations. No demands or territorial claims backed by military force. Just those 6 words repeated endlessly into the void. And that should have been the end of it. Most species, when faced with such a clear warning, would have simply respected the boundaries and moved on. Space was vast after all. There was plenty of room for everyone. But curiosity, it seemed, was not unique to humans. 12 different species over the span of 2 centuries had decided that the warnings were either bluffs or superstition. 12 expeditions had crossed into human space, determined to discover what the mysterious humans were hiding. Some had been scientific missions, driven by academic curiosity. Others had been military reconnaissance, sent by governments that feared a potential threat. A few had been entrepreneurial ventures, hoping to establish trade or discover valuable resources. Not one of them had ever come back. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signals were ever received. No debris fields or signs of battle ever appeared. The ships simply crossed the boundary into human space and vanished as completely as if they had never existed. We need answers, Vrel continued, his voice cutting through the worried murmurs. This mystery has haunted the Galactic Council for too long. I am formally authorizing a reconnaissance mission. Stealth approach. Observation only. We will use our most advanced cloaking technology and maintain maximum distance from any human presence. Before the words had finished echoing through the chamber, a figure stood up in the Explorer Corps section. Captain Ryan Torres was young by any species standards, barely into his 30s. He had the kind of eager ambition that made older officers nervous. His service record showed a brilliant tactical mind and absolutely no fear. "I volunteer," Torres announced, his voice steady and confident. "I command the Vigilant Eye, which is equipped with the latest generation cloaking systems. My crew is small, experienced, and expendable if necessary. We can get the answers the Council needs." The chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates supported the mission. Others argued it was too dangerous, that they should continue respecting human boundaries. A few suggested sending automated probes instead of risking lives. That's when Lisa finally spoke. "Captain Torres," she said quietly from the back of the chamber, but somehow her voice carried perfectly through the noise. The entire assembly fell silent. "A word of advice. If you see something you don't understand, turn back immediately. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to study it. Don't convince yourself that your instruments are malfunctioning. Just leave." The way she said it made several delegates physically shudder. There was something in her tone, a weight of knowledge that went beyond simple warning. Ambassador Vrel turned his large compound eyes toward her. "Commander Garrett, are humans hostile? Is your species a threat to the galactic community?" Lisa smiled, but there was no humor in it, only an infinite sadness that seemed far too old for her relatively young face. "No," she said softly. "We're not hostile. We're protective." "Protective of what?" Vrel pressed. Lisa met his gaze steadily. "Of you." The chamber exploded into confused chatter. Questions flew from every direction. Demands for explanation. Accusations of deception. But Lisa said nothing more. She simply stood, nodded once to the council and walked toward the exit. The vote was called. Despite the confusion and fear, curiosity won. It always did. The council approved Torres's mission with a unanimous vote, though several delegates looked like they might regret it later. As the session ended and delegates filed out, Lisa caught up with Torres in the corridor outside. The young captain was already reviewing mission parameters on his data pad, eager to begin. "Captain," Lisa said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He stopped and looked at her. "I can't stop you. The council has given its approval. But please understand something. My ancestors chose that sector for a very specific reason. We didn't run away from the galaxy because we were afraid of you. We positioned ourselves there because we needed to be between the galaxy and something else." Torres's confident expression faltered slightly. "What else? What are you protecting us from?" Lisa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the metal walls of the station. "You'll know when you see it," she finally said. "If you're strong enough to look." Then she walked away, leaving Torres standing alone in the corridor, suddenly less certain than he'd been moments before. The Vigilant Eye crossed into human territory exactly 3 weeks after the council session. Captain Torres had spent those weeks preparing his crew, running simulations, and studying every scrap of information available about the 12 lost expeditions. Which admittedly wasn't much. He'd kept his crew deliberately small. 5 people total, each representing a different species from across the galaxy. His first officer was Jessica Chin, a tactical specialist from the Centauri colonies with nerves of steel and a mind like a computer. Mark Sullivan handled engineering, a cybernetically enhanced being whose original species had long ago merged with technology. David Kim served as science officer, gifted with natural empathic abilities that let him sense emotional states across vast distances. Amy Rodriguez managed weapons systems, a combat veteran from 3 different wars who rarely showed fear. Together they represented the best the council could offer. If anyone could survive human space and return with answers, Torres believed it would be this crew. The crossing itself was anticlimactic. No alarms. No resistance. The warning beacons simply repeated their message as the Vigilant Eye slipped past them using the most advanced cloaking technology the galaxy had ever developed. Their ship became virtually invisible, a ghost drifting through the void. "Cloaking systems holding steady," Mark reported from his engineering station, his cybernetic eye glowing softly as he monitored their power signatures. "No detection signals. We're completely invisible to standard sensors." But despite the successful infiltration, Torres felt deeply uneasy. Something was wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly bothered him. They'd expected military patrols, weapon platforms, aggressive challenges from defense forces. Some kind of explanation for why 12 expeditions had vanished without a trace. They'd prepared for hostile engagement, for running battles through asteroid fields, for desperate escapes through jump points. Instead, they found something far more unsettling than any military response. Normalcy. Human cargo ships moved peacefully between colonies, their transponders openly broadcasting cargo manifests and flight plans. Civilian communication channels filled their monitors with dozens of simultaneous broadcasts. News reports discussed local politics and weather patterns. Entertainment programs showed humans laughing at comedy shows. Children's educational programming taught mathematics and history. It was exactly like any other civilized sector in the galaxy. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. They're just living here, Jessica said, her voice colored with genuine confusion. She'd been monitoring communications for hours now, expecting coded military traffic or signs of aggressive intent. Like any other civilization. There's nothing threatening about any of this. Torres nodded slowly, but his unease only grew stronger. This normalcy felt wrong somehow, like a mask covering something underneath. David Kim hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, which was unusual for him. The science officer sat hunched over his sensor array, his expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. Finally, he looked up at Torres with visible concern. "Captain, we have a serious problem. The star charts are completely wrong. These systems don't match our database. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. According to every astrophysics model we have, at least 17 stellar bodies exist here that shouldn't be possible." Torres moved to stand behind David's station, looking at the data himself. "Sensor malfunction? No, sir. I've run diagnostics 3 times. The stars are definitely there. Our instruments detect them clearly. Ships are orbiting them. People are living on planets around them. But according to our galactic database, this entire region should be empty space. It's like these stars were added to the universe after our maps were made." "That's impossible," Mark said from engineering. "Stars don't just appear. They take millions of years to form." "I know," David replied quietly. "But I'm telling you what the sensors show. Either our entire understanding of astrophysics is wrong, or something very strange is happening in human space." Before Torres could respond, Amy suddenly went rigid at her weapons station. Her hand flew to her control panel, fingers dancing across the interface as warning lights began flashing. "Contact," she announced sharply. "Human vessel approaching. Captain, the movement vector is impossible. It's traveling through space that our sensors say is completely empty. There's nothing there, but something is definitely coming toward us." Torres felt ice run down his spine. "Battle stations. Prepare evasive maneuvers." But before anyone could move, the main view screen activated on its own. Nobody had touched the controls. Nobody had accepted an incoming transmission. The screen simply turned on, as if the ship itself had decided they needed to see this. A human man appeared on the screen. He looked to be in his 40s, with lines around his eyes that suggested either frequent smiling or frequent stress. He wore a casual flight jacket rather than a military uniform, and his expression was warm, almost friendly. But his eyes held something else, a deep, tired knowledge that made Torres's unease spike even higher. "Hello there," the man said, his tone genuinely welcoming despite the circumstances. "I'm Captain Jake Mitchell of the Border Watch. You folks made it farther than most visitors do. Usually people panic at the outer marker beacons and turn back. I'm impressed, honestly. Would you like to come aboard my ship? I think we should talk." Torres exchanged quick glances with his crew. They were all thinking the same thing. They'd been detected despite having the most sophisticated cloaking technology in the galaxy. This Jake Mitchell had found them as easily as if they'd been broadcasting their location on all frequencies. "How did you," Torres began. "See you?" Jake interrupted, still smiling that understanding smile. "Captain, your ship exists in normal 3-dimensional space. That makes you extremely visible out here. You're cloaked from conventional sensors, sure, but that's not really the problem. Come on over to the Border Watch. I'll explain everything and then you can decide what to do with the information." "Fair enough." Torres knew this violated every protocol. The mission called for observation only, no direct contact. But they'd already been discovered, and this human seemed willing to provide exactly the answers the Council wanted. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him to run, Torres made his decision. "Prepare a shuttle," he ordered. "We're going to meet Captain Mitchell." The crew moved to comply, but every one of them looked afraid of what they might learn. The shuttle docked with the Border Watch, and the moment Torres stepped through the airlock, his eyes began to hurt. Not a sharp pain, but a dull, persistent ache that made him want to close them and look away. Something about what he was seeing didn't match what his brain expected to process. The ship itself looked normal enough from the outside. Standard human design, similar to cargo vessels they'd been observing for days. Hull plating, observation windows, docking ports, all exactly where they should be. But the moment they entered the interior, reality seemed to bend in ways that shouldn't be possible. The corridor they walked down stretched far longer than the exterior hull could possibly contain. Torres had spent 20 years in space. He knew ship dimensions instinctively. This corridor was impossible. It extended at least 200 meters, yet the border watch was only a 100-meter vessel. Doorways opened onto rooms that couldn't fit within the ship's frame. Through one portal, Torres glimpsed what appeared to be a massive garden with trees reaching toward a sky that shouldn't exist inside a spacecraft. Through another, he saw what looked like an observation deck overlooking swirling colors that hurt to look at directly. Human crew members moved through these spaces as if everything was completely ordinary. One technician walked casually up a wall, perpendicular to Torres' sense of gravity, carrying a tool kit. Another crew member stepped directly through what appeared to be solid bulkhead and emerged from a different wall 10 meters away, continuing her conversation without pause. Everyone acted like this was the most normal thing in the universe. Mark's cybernetic implants began sparking and glitching. His enhanced eye flickered erratically as it tried to process the spatial dimensions around them. Amy's hand instinctively went to her weapon, though what she could possibly shoot in this situation, Torres had no idea. David had gone pale, his empathic senses clearly overwhelmed by something his biology wasn't designed to handle. "Sorry about the disorientation," Jake said cheerfully, leading them deeper into the impossible ship. He seemed genuinely apologetic, like a host concerned that his guests weren't comfortable. "Your brains aren't adapted yet. Takes time for neural pathways to adjust to the way space works out here. Don't worry though, the nausea usually passes after an hour or two." He led them into what he called an observation lounge, though Torres wasn't sure what they were supposed to be observing. The room was comfortable enough, with couches and chairs arranged in a conversational circle. Large windows showed the starfield outside, which at least looked normal. "Can I get anyone something to drink?" Jake offered. "Coffee?" "We've got most dietary requirements covered. Learned that from hosting the crews that decided to stay with us." Torres and his crew sat down, grateful for something solid and normal to anchor themselves to. Jake, however, remained standing. Except he wasn't standing on the floor like a normal person. He stood casually at a 90-degree angle to them, as if the wall was his floor and gravity was merely a suggestion. "I'll give you the short version," Jake began, his tone shifting from friendly host to something more serious. "Because the long version would take days and I'm not sure your minds could handle days of this right now. 250 years ago, our colony ship was dying. Not damaged in a battle or anything dramatic like that. Just failing. The fusion reactors were slowly giving out. Life support systems were compromised beyond repair. We'd burned through our fuel reserves trying to find a suitable planet, and there was nothing within range. We were going to die out here in the void between stars, thousands of light years from Earth, completely alone." Jake paused, his expression distant, as if remembering stories passed down through generations. "So when we detected something out there in the dark, something that shouldn't exist according to everything we knew about physics and reality, we made a choice. We were dead anyway. What did we have to lose? We made contact." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her tactical mind clearly racing through implications. "Contact with what?" Jake's smile faded entirely. "The beings that exist outside normal reality. The things that live in the spaces between dimensions. The entities that every sentient species instinctively fears but refuses to acknowledge. Your people have stories about them, I'm sure. Every civilization does. The things in the dark. The shadows at the edge of perception. The feeling that something is watching from somewhere you can't quite see." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Torres felt his crew go absolutely rigid beside him. He knew what Jake was talking about. Every child in every galactic species learned the same fundamental warnings from the moment they were old enough to understand. Never look into the void. Never acknowledge what dwells in the gaps between stars. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to communicate with the outside. Because reality itself could unravel. Those weren't superstitions or religious beliefs. They were survival instincts coded into the DNA of every spacefaring species. The fear of what existed beyond normal space was universal, primal, and absolute. "They weren't malicious," Jake continued, seeming to sense their horror. "That's the thing everyone gets wrong. They're not evil or hostile. They're just fundamentally different. Curious. They'd never encountered thinking beings before, beings like us who exist in linear time and occupy three-dimensional space. We were as strange to them as they were to us. So we made a deal. They taught us how to survive out here, how to manipulate the underlying structure of spacetime, how to fold reality so we could exist in places where we shouldn't be able to. In exchange, we became something like interpreters, ambassadors, guardians. We maintained the boundaries between dimensions. Mark's cybernetic translator implant suddenly sparked violently, sending a shower of small electrical discharges across his temple. Amy's weapon system's console began displaying contradictory data that made no sense. Targets that existed and didn't exist simultaneously, distances measured in negative numbers. David gasped audibly, his empathic abilities flooding him with sensations that shouldn't be possible, emotions from things that weren't quite alive in any way he understood. "We keep them contained," Jake said softly, and for the first time Torres heard the weight of centuries in his voice. "And we keep you safe. This entire sector isn't just human territory. It's a buffer zone. Humanity lives on the edge of reality itself, holding back things that would consume the galaxy if they ever fully broke through into normal space. That's why we warn others away. Not because we're hostile to you, because being near us means being near them. And most species simply can't handle that kind of exposure." Torres forced himself to speak, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "The 12 expeditions that came before us. What happened to them?" Jake's expression filled with sadness. "Some got lost in dimensional rifts. We try to patrol for them, but space out here doesn't work the way it does in normal territory. Some went mad from exposure to things their minds couldn't process, and we're caring for them in medical facilities, hoping they'll recover someday. 2 crews actually understood what we were doing and volunteered to join us. They're stationed at monitoring outposts now, standing watch alongside human crews. But we warn others away because this burden is ours. We chose it. Why not tell the Galactic Council?" Torres demanded, anger mixing with his fear. "Why not ask for help? Why stand alone for 2.5 centuries? Jake's smile returned, but it was infinitely sad, carrying the weight of generations of lonely vigilance. Would they believe us without seeing it firsthand? And more importantly, could they survive seeing it? Human cognition is strange, Captain. We evolved on a world where we had to imagine dangers we couldn't see. We believed in invisible forces, told stories about monsters lurking in shadows, created gods and demons to explain things we didn't understand. That cultural and psychological development made us uniquely qualified for this work. We're not being noble or heroic. We're being practical. We're the only ones built for this." Jessica whispered, barely audible, "You're protecting the entire galaxy from something we can't even comprehend." "Yes," Jake confirmed simply. "And now you're about to decide whether you can handle knowing that." Jake stood before them in that impossible room, his expression grave. The friendly casualness from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by something far more serious. He looked like a soldier about to brief his troops before a suicide mission. "I need to show you," he said slowly, measuring each word carefully, "because you came this far and you deserve the truth. But I'm offering you a choice first, and I need you to understand that this is a real choice with real consequences." He gestured toward the corridor behind him. "I can escort you back to the border right now. We'll guide you safely out of human territory, make sure you don't get lost in any dimensional rifts and send you home. No shame in that. No judgment. You'll have learned more than most species ever do about us, and that might be enough for your counsel." Then his voice dropped lower, harder. "Or you can see what we actually guard against. But you need to understand something before you decide. What you witness may break you. Not physically, your bodies will be fine. But mentally, psychologically, spiritually, if you believe in such things. It's broken stronger beings than you. Some of those 12 expeditions? They're still in our medical facilities, staring at walls, unable to speak coherently. Their minds just couldn't handle what they saw." Torres looked at his crew. It wasn't a decision he could make alone. They'd come this far together, and they deserved to choose their own path forward. Mark's cybernetic implants were still sparking intermittently, throwing errors he'd never seen before. The advanced technology that had been seamlessly integrated with his biology for decades was failing in ways that shouldn't be possible. David sat hunched over, his empathic abilities clearly overwhelmed by sensations his species had never evolved to process. Amy's hand trembled slightly near her weapon, and Torres had known her long enough to know that Amy never trembled. She'd faced down enemy warships without flinching. But Jessica met his eyes and gave a single, firm nod. She'd made her choice. One by one, the others nodded as well. They'd come for answers. They'd promised the council they'd discover the truth. And despite their fear, maybe because of it, they needed to see what humanity was protecting them from. "Show us," Torres said, his voice steadier than he felt. Jake studied each of their faces for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. But stay close to me. Don't touch anything that looks strange. Don't stare too long at anything that moves in ways you don't understand. And if I tell you to close your eyes or look away, you do it immediately. Understood. They all agreed. The journey to the edge of human territory took 3 hours, though time seemed to move strangely in the spaces they traveled through. They transferred to a smaller vessel, something Jake called a boundary runner, designed specifically for operating near what he called the membrane. When they finally arrived at the monitoring station, Torres understood immediately why every alarm on the vigilant eye had been screaming warnings when they entered this system. The station orbited a star that shouldn't exist. Couldn't exist according to every law of physics Torres had learned. Instead of the bright yellow or white light of normal stars, this one bled purple-black illumination that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. Looking at it made Torres's eyes water and his head pound. Don't look directly at it, Jake warned. Your brain will try to make sense of what it's seeing and fail. It's not really a star in the way you understand stars. It's more like an anchor point, a place where reality is thin enough that we can monitor what's on the other side. He led them to a specialized observation room with heavily filtered viewports. Multiple layers of some kind of protective material blocked most of the star's light, making it possible to look without immediate pain. Ready? Jake asked. No one answered, but no one backed away either. Jake adjusted the filters and Torres saw it. The membrane. Reality itself had a surface here. It looked like water, thin and rippling, stretching across the viewport like a soap bubble reflecting impossible colors. Torres could see through it barely to what lay beyond. And on the other side things moved. Vast shapes that hurt to perceive, too large and too strange for his mind to properly categorize. Geometries that bent in directions that didn't exist, angles that pointed nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Entities that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3, their true forms bleeding through into normal space in ways that made Torres's stomach twist. He wanted to look away but couldn't. It was like watching something terrible happening, knowing you should turn away but being unable to break your gaze. That's just a small section, Jake said quietly beside him. The membrane stretches for thousands of light years around this entire sector. And they're always testing it, always probing for weaknesses. Torres finally managed to tear his eyes away from the viewport and looked around the observation station. Human ships were everywhere, hundreds of them forming a defensive perimeter around the membrane. But they weren't armed with conventional weapons. Instead, they carried strange equipment that seemed to pulse with its own light, machinery that Torres's engineer brain couldn't begin to understand. A human technician named Laura approached them. She looked young, maybe 30, but her eyes held an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting an endless war without hope of victory, only hope of holding the line for one more day. We've been fighting this war for 247 years, Laura explained, her voice flat with fatigue. Every single day without pause, without rest. Most species would collapse from the psychic pressure alone just being near the membrane. But humans? We're stubborn. We survived ice ages on our homeworld when we should have gone extinct. We survived our own nuclear weapons, our own worst impulses, our own tendency toward self-destruction. Turns out we're also the only ones crazy enough to stare into the darkness and tell it to stay back. As they watched, the membrane suddenly bulged inward. Something on the other side was pushing through, trying to claw its way into normal reality. Torres felt his heart hammering as a breach began to form, the membrane stretching impossibly thin. Human ships converged on the breach point instantly, moving with practiced precision. But they didn't fire weapons. Instead, Torres felt something he'd never experienced before, a wave of concentrated human willpower, mental discipline so intense it became almost physical. Dozens of human minds working in perfect synchronization, not attacking the breach but willing reality itself to reject the intrusion. 3 humans at nearby stations suddenly collapsed, blood streaming from their noses and ears. But the breach sealed, snapping shut like elastic pulled too far. Medical teams rushed to help the fallen crew members. Laura barely glanced at them. They'll recover, she said with grim certainty. They always do. Usually. The 12 expeditions that came before us, Jake said quietly, his voice heavy with old grief. Some couldn't handle what they saw here. Their minds broke trying to process it. Others understood what we were doing and volunteered to join us. They're stationed at outposts now, standing watch alongside human crews. We honored all their choices. But this is why we warn others away. We chose this burden because we had the psychological framework to bear it. We don't ask others to share it unless they volunteer with full knowledge of what they're signing up for. Amy finally found her voice, though it shook slightly. She asked the question haunting all of them. Why? Why do this alone? Why not tell the galaxy, raise an army, share the burden? Jake's smile was sad and infinitely tired. Because we're built for it. Our history, our psychology, our stubborn refusal to give up even when things are hopeless. It all prepared us for this. And because you deserve to live in a galaxy where you don't have to know what's waiting in the dark. That's not nobility. That's not heroism. It's just us being practical about what needs to be done. Torres looked at the membrane again, at the shapes moving beyond it, and finally understood why humans had isolated themselves. It wasn't fear of the galaxy. It was protection of it. Back aboard the Vigilant Eye, Torres and his crew sat in complete silence. The kind of silence that follows trauma, when words feel inadequate to describe what you've experienced. They'd returned from the monitoring station hours ago, but nobody had moved from their positions. They just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to process what they'd witnessed. They had evidence now. Recordings stored in their ship's databanks. Sensor readings that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it firsthand. Proof of humanity's secret, documented and verified. But Torres wasn't sure that proof would mean anything to people who hadn't stood at the edge of reality and looked beyond. David sat hunched in the corner, his hands pressed against his temples. His empathic abilities, once so precise and controlled, were now damaged in ways their medical scanner couldn't fully analyze. He'd felt the emotions of those things beyond the membrane, if they even had emotions, and it had burned pathways in his brain that might never heal properly. He kept muttering about colors that didn't exist and sounds that had no source. Mark's cybernetic implants had burned out completely. The sophisticated technology that had been part of him for decades was now just dead metal and plastic. His enhanced eye was dark, his neural processing boosters offline. He'd have to get everything replaced when they returned to civilized space, assuming anyone could even repair the kind of damage that exposure to twisted reality had caused. Amy sat at her weapons console, but her hands shook slightly when she tried to operate the controls. Amy, who had nerves of steel, who had faced enemy fire without flinching, now trembled at the memory of what she'd seen. She'd realized, down at that monitoring station, that all her weapons training and combat experience meant absolutely nothing against what waited beyond the membrane. Jessica broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we tell the council? It was the question they'd all been avoiding. They'd been sent to gather information, to discover why human space was forbidden. They'd succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But what did they do with that knowledge? Before Torres could formulate an answer, the communication system suddenly activated. Alarms began blaring across the ship. Not their alarms but emergency signals being broadcast from the human monitoring stations. Jake Mitchell's face appeared on the view screen, and the friendly, understanding expression was completely gone. He looked urgent, almost desperate in a way Torres hadn't seen before. Major breach forming, Jake said rapidly, words tumbling out fast. Biggest we've seen in 50 years. Something's pushing through hard and we're going to need every bit of strength we can muster. I know you folks aren't equipped for this. I know you're not trained. But we could use any help you can offer. Even just your presence might make a difference. But I understand completely if. We'll help, Torres said immediately, cutting him off. His crew turned to stare at him. He'd made the decision without consulting them, without taking a vote, without even thinking it through. It was pure instinct, the same instinct that had made him volunteer for this mission in the first place. Then one by one his crew nodded their agreement. David, despite his damaged mind. Mark with his burned-out implants. Amy with her trembling hands. Jessica always steady, always reliable. They weren't equipped for this kind of fight. They had no training in mental discipline or reality manipulation. They didn't know how to force existence itself to obey their will. But they understood now why 12 expeditions had never fully returned. Some of those crews had made a choice, to stand with humanity against the darkness regardless of the cost. The Vigilant Eye raced back to the monitoring station at maximum speed. The battle, when they arrived, was unlike anything in Torres's entire military career. There were no missiles, no energy weapons, no tactical maneuvers. It was fought with will, with consciousness, with raw human determination imposing order on chaos. Torres felt his mind being stretched to its absolute breaking point. He felt dimensions he couldn't name pressing against his thoughts, trying to push their way into his awareness. He felt things that didn't exist trying to convince him they did. He felt reality itself becoming negotiable, flexible, uncertain. But around him, he felt hundreds of human minds working in synchronization. Not telepathy exactly, but something close. A collective force of will, generations of practice and sacrifice, all focused on a single purpose: holding the line, keeping the darkness back, protecting the galaxy from something it couldn't protect itself from. Torres added his own will to theirs, insignificant as it was. His crew did the same, 5 alien minds joining the chorus of human determination. It felt like trying to hold back an ocean with his bare hands, but he held anyway. When it was finally over, when the breach sealed and the membrane stabilized, Torres found himself on the deck of the Vigilant Eye without remembering how he got there. 3 of his crew members were in medical comas, their vital signs weak but stable. David, Mark and Amy had given everything they had and paid the price. Torres was still conscious, but he felt fundamentally changed in ways he couldn't articulate. Like he'd seen something that altered the basic structure of how he understood reality. Jake found him in the medical bay, standing watch over his unconscious crew. The human captain looked exhausted but grateful. "Thank you," Jake said simply. "Not many non-humans can endure even brief exposure to what you just experienced. You proved something important today. We're not alone in being willing to face this. That matters more than you know." Torres's voice came out rough and hoarse. "I need to report to the council. They sent me for answers." Jake nodded slowly. "Tell them what you think is wise. We trust your judgment, Captain. You've earned that trust." 6 weeks passed before Torres could stand before the Galactic Council again. 6 weeks of medical treatment for his crew, of writing reports that seemed inadequate no matter how he phrased them, of deciding what truth was worth sharing and what truth would cause more harm than good. David was recovering, but his empathic abilities would never fully return. The pathways in his brain that had allowed him to sense emotions across vast distances were permanently damaged. Mark's implants remained completely non-functional despite the best technicians in the galaxy trying to repair them. They'd all paid a terrible price for knowledge. The council chamber was packed when Torres delivered his report. Every delegate from every species had come to hear what the expedition had discovered. "Human space is restricted for good reason," Torres said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "Humans are protecting us from a threat most species cannot comprehend. They require no assistance unless specifically requested. The border restrictions should be honored, not from fear but from respect." Ambassador Vrel's translator clicked urgently. "What threat? What did you see?" Torres met his eyes steadily. "One that would break this council to witness. Trust me when I say humanity has earned its isolation, and our gratitude." The chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates demanded more information. Others accused Torres of hiding critical intelligence. A few insisted on sending their own expeditions to verify his claims. But Torres stood firm. He'd seen what full knowledge could do to unprepared minds. He'd watched 3 of his crew members collapse trying to process what existed beyond the membrane. Some truths were too dangerous to share widely. After hours of heated discussion, the council finally voted. Human space would remain restricted, now with official endorsement and council backing. The warning beacons would be honored as legitimate protective measures. After the session ended, Lisa Garrett approached Torres in the emptying chamber. She looked at him with understanding in her eyes, the understanding of someone who knew what he'd witnessed. "Thank you for not sharing everything," she said quietly. "Some truths would destroy the stability we've built. Panic would serve no one." Torres felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift slightly from his shoulders. "Your people shouldn't have to stand alone out there." Lisa smiled, sad but genuine. "We don't. Not anymore. Now you know we're there standing watch. That's enough. That has to be enough." Before Torres left for his next assignment, one final message arrived from Jake Mitchell. "Captain Torres and crew, you showed courage beyond measure today. You stood with us when you didn't have to, faced something you weren't prepared for and held the line anyway. You proved that humanity isn't as alone as we sometimes feel. If the galaxy ever faces something that requires our particular expertise, we'll answer the call. But until then we'll keep our watch. We're not monsters hiding in the dark. We're just the ones who chose to look at monsters so others don't have to. Clear skies, Captain. Fair winds. Stay safe out there." Torres stood at the viewport of his ship, looking out at the vast starfield. Somewhere beyond those distant lights, at the very edge of known space, humans stood guard over the boundaries of reality itself. They held back the darkness year after year, generation after generation, protecting a galaxy that had feared them without understanding why. Now, finally, someone understood. And that understanding, Torres realized, was its own kind of burden. knowledge he'd carry for the rest of his life. But it was a burden worth bearing. Because now when people asked him about human space, about why it was forbidden, he could tell them the simple truth: humans aren't the danger. They're the shield standing between us and the real danger. And that shield has never faltered in 247 years. Torres hoped it never would.